Hello everyone, and welcome back. Imagine this, a courtroom in medieval France. Judges in long robes. Priests clutching crosses. The smell of straw and candle wax filling the air. And in the center, standing in chains before the bench, is not a man but a pig. It sounds like a dark joke, but this really happened. In 1386, in the small French town of Falaise, a pig was officially put on trial for murder. There were witnesses. A judge, a defense lawyer, and even a written verdict. The accused, a farm animal that had killed a child. The sentence, death by hanging. This is how far the medieval world went to make sense of chaos. In an age when famine, plague, and violence were constant, people wanted to believe that everything, even tragedy, had a moral reason. So when the world did not make sense, they built a courtroom around it. The story begins on an ordinary morning in Normandy. A farmer's pig wanders into the street. Somewhere along the way, it attacks a child. No one knows why. Maybe the child startled it, maybe it was hungry, or maybe it was just a moment of bad luck. Today we would call it an accident, but to medieval people, accidents did not exist. Every event carried divine meaning, and if something went wrong, there had to be guilt. The villagers captured the pig, chained it, and brought it before the local court. Instead of killing it on the spot, they opened a case. Witnesses were called. Clerks took notes. Someone was assigned to defend the animal. It was not satire. It was law. In that small, candle-lit courtroom, the pig stood where human criminals usually stood. The judge read the charges with malice aforethought, the murder of a child, and the crowd fell silent. They believed they were witnessing justice, not theater. The pig's lawyer argued that animals lacked understanding, that it could not possibly have acted with intent. It was a logical defense, but logic was not the point. What mattered was restoring order, making the town believe that balance could be repaired. So the verdict was guilty. The punishment, execution. Days later, the entire town gathered in the square. The pig was dressed in human clothes, a symbol that it was being judged as a person. A priest gave last rites. The executioner tightened the rope. When the bell rang, the crowd cheered. It was both brutal and reassuring. The people of Falaise believed that by punishing the pig, they had cleansed the moral stain from their world. Word of the trial spread fast. Eventually, it reached the church, and the bishops were furious, not out of compassion for the animal, but because they had not been asked for permission. If animals were going to be tried and punished, that fell under church authority. Only the clergy could decide the fate of God's creatures. So a new law was written: no animal could be tried or executed without church authorization. It sounds absurd now, but it became a real rule that spread across Europe. This single case changed the legal landscape. Suddenly, animals were treated as moral subjects. Goats were accused of indecency. Roosters were burned for witchcraft. Rats were summoned to court for stealing grain. In one trial, the rat's lawyer argued that his clients could not attend the hearing because of the danger posed by cats on the road. People recorded these events seriously, filing them in legal archives alongside human cases. But what looks like madness had logic behind it. The medieval world ran on fear of chaos. If crops failed or children died, the community demanded an explanation. Punishing an animal was less frightening than admitting that the universe was random. Every execution, no matter how ridiculous, turned uncertainty into ritual. It was a way of saying, we still understand the rules. For the church, animal trials were useful up to a point. They reinforced the idea that God's justice covered everything, even beasts. But when the spectacle made the clergy look foolish, the church stepped in to regulate it. Priests now had to bless the proceedings and make sure divine order was respected. In trying to control absurdity, they ended up preserving it. Bureaucracy thrives on fear. Once a process exists, it never disappears. It is easy to laugh at these trials, but they reveal something familiar. Humans can't stand disorder. When tragedy strikes today, we still look for someone to blame. One shocking accident becomes the reason for a new regulation. A viral mistake leads to a public apology and a rewritten policy. It is the same instinct the villagers had in Falaise. If we can name the culprit, maybe the world will feel stable again. The law requiring church permission for animal trials was not about justice. It was about control, religious, political, emotional control. It let authorities decide when chaos could be acknowledged and when it must be silenced. Beneath all the ceremony, the message was clear: the system always has the final word, even over pigs. The story of the Falaise pig endures because it is ridiculous and revealing. It shows that behind every strange law is a moment of fear, a need to make the universe behave. The people of that small French town were not cruel, they were terrified of meaninglessness. So they wrote their fear into law. And in doing so, they created one of history's strangest trials, a perfect symbol of how far humans will go to make sense of the senseless. When they hanged that pig, they were not punishing an animal. They were punishing uncertainty. And centuries later, every time a government rushes to write a new rule after one bizarre incident, they are doing the same thing. Because the truth is, the pig may be gone but the mindset that killed it never really died. Picture a summer day in Bohemia, sometime in the 14th century. The banners are up, the crowd is cheering, and knights in shining armor are lining up for a jousting tournament. Horses snort, lances glint. And the air smells of hay and wine. It is supposed to be a show of strength, bravery, and nobility. But in this particular tournament, someone decides to add a touch of humor, and that decision ends up changing the law. One ambitious nobleman, bored of the usual spectacle, thought it would be funny to dress a goose in armor. Not just any armor, but a custom-made miniature set, a tiny breastplate, a helmet. Even a little shield strapped to its wing. He called it Sir Goose of the Pond and paraded it around before the crowd, laughing. It was meant as a harmless joke, a bit of comic relief in a world that took itself far too seriously. But then the goose escaped. It flapped straight into the tournament field, spooking one of the horses. The startled animal reared up, throwing its rider to the ground. Lances fell. People screamed, and what started as a prank turned into chaos. The joke had become dangerous. The injured knight was carried away, the crowd panicked, and what could have been forgotten as a silly incident became an official matter of order and safety. When the dust settled, the local lords were not amused. Tournaments were sacred symbols of chivalry, discipline, and the social order. Allowing a bird in armor to ruin one made the whole event look ridiculous. And nothing terrified medieval authority more than ridicule. So they did what authorities always do when something embarrassing happens: they wrote a law. A formal decree was issued: no person shall arm, dress, or adorn any beast or fowl in imitation of noble combatants. It was short, strict, and completely humorless. But behind its wording lay a clear message: stop making a mockery of power. The armored goose law spread to neighboring regions, with other courts issuing similar bans. Some justified it as a safety measure. Others framed it as protecting the dignity of tournaments. Either way, the rule existed not because people were actually arming animals on a regular basis, but because one foolish noble had embarrassed the institution. And that is where the real story lies, not in the goose, but in the reaction. Medieval law was not only about right and wrong. It was about maintaining appearances. Anything that made the ruling class look foolish was treated as a threat. The goose did not just disrupt a joust, it disrupted the illusion of authority. It is strange, but deeply human. When people in power lose face, they do not laugh it off, they legislate. Instead of saying, "Let us not take ourselves so seriously," they double down on formality. The medieval lords could not undo the absurdity of that goose running across the field. So they did the next best thing, they made sure no one could ever make them look that foolish again. If you look closely, this pattern repeats everywhere in history. One man does something reckless or comedic, and suddenly the whole system locks down. It is not about justice, it is about preserving image. The armored goose was harmless, but the laughter it caused was not. Laughter is dangerous in societies built on strict hierarchies. Because it makes everyone seem equal for a moment. In medieval Europe, humor had limits. You could make jokes about peasants or devils, but not about the nobility or their rituals. Those rituals, tournaments, ceremonies, nightly games were the glue holding the social order together. To laugh at them was to question them. The armored goose did exactly that. It made the whole idea of chivalry look like theater. And theater does not mix well with authority. So, in one afternoon, a joke turned into legislation. The decree against animal imitation of knights stayed in effect for generations. It shows how a single embarrassing moment can outlive the people who caused it. Nobody remembers the nobleman's name, but the law he inspired survived in dusty records. And honestly, if you squint, you can still see traces of that mindset today. One person breaks a rule in a ridiculous way. And instead of simply laughing and moving on, we respond with bans, warnings, and disclaimers. Someone flies a drone too close to a parade, and suddenly there is a 50-page document outlining drone-free zones. Someone makes a viral video mocking a ceremony, and now recording devices are restricted. It is the same reflex that wrote the no armored geese rule: control the laughter before it spreads. The story of the armored goose is not just a funny medieval anecdote, it is a glimpse into how fragile authority really is. The law that followed was not about public safety or animal welfare. It was about pride. A goose disrupted the show, and the law was there to make sure power did not get laughed at again. It is a reminder that even in the age of knights and castles, dignity could be as delicate as feathers. And that sometimes, history's strangest laws begin not with crime but with comedy. The story begins, as many medieval disasters do, with too much wine and too much pride. Picture a bright summer afternoon in 1364, at a jousting tournament in Germany. The crowd is restless, the banners are flying, and the air hums with excitement. Among the knights preparing to compete is Count Heinrich von Schwarzburg, a man known less for his skill and more for his enthusiasm for drink. Jousting was supposed to be noble entertainment. A display of control, courage, and composure. But Count Heinrich had a different idea. He believed that wine gave him spiritual courage. In other words, he was very drunk and very confident. He mounted his horse, wobbled in the saddle, and assured everyone that he fought better this way. The crowd laughed nervously. His squire whispered for him to stop. But the count charged anyway. What happened next became legend. Instead of striking his opponent, the count's lance veered wildly and impaled a monk standing near the edge of the field. The monk had been praying for the safety of the competitors. The irony was so thick it almost felt divine. The monk survived just long enough for people to realize what had happened. A nobleman, drunk at a holy event, had nearly killed a servant of God. The laughter vanished. Panic rippled through the tournament. The count was dragged from his horse. His helmet yanked off, his face red not just from wine but from humiliation. The church officials were furious, and so were the nobles who had just watched their proud tournament turned into a farce. Medieval tournaments were more than sport, they were propaganda. They showed that knights were disciplined, honorable, and favored by God. One drunk man's mistake threatened the illusion that the social elite were better than everyone else. So, to protect their image, the council did what councils always do after a public scandal: they wrote a law. From that day forward, no man was allowed to compete in a tournament while under the influence of wine, ale, or any intoxicating spirit. It might have been one of the earliest do not ride drunk laws in history. The penalty was severe: disqualification, loss of rank, and in some cases, public penance at church. But beneath the moral language, the rule was about reputation. It was not really about protecting lives, it was about protecting appearances. The idea that a knight, a supposed model of discipline, could make such a fool of himself was intolerable. The law became a patch on a hole in the social fabric. And yet, like many laws born from embarrassment, it did not work well. Enforcement was tricky. Knights still drank. Ale and wine were safer than water in many regions. There were even rumors of secret flasks hidden inside armor. When inspectors tried to enforce the rule, some knights bribed them with casks of wine. Others claimed they were only spiritually drunk, a convenient excuse that blended arrogance with theology. Still, the law remained. Its real power was not in punishment but in symbolism. It reminded the nobility that their actions reflected the order of the world. If a monk could be injured by a drunken knight, what else could go wrong? If those at the top could lose control, maybe the whole hierarchy was fragile. The church and the aristocracy could not risk that thought taking hold. So, every time a tournament was held, heralds announced the new rule: let no man compete who is drunk in body or spirit. It became part of the ritual, a moral disclaimer recited before the lances clashed. People forgot the count's name. But they remembered the shame that made the rule necessary. The story of the drunken knight law reveals something uncomfortable about medieval justice. Most laws were not made to prevent harm, they were made to preserve dignity. They existed to keep the world believable. The idea of a holy order, a chain linking God to king to knight to peasant, was fragile. If one drunk nobleman could break it, the whole performance cracked. And maybe that is why the church moved so quickly after the incident. The image of a wounded monk on the ground, struck by a drunken knight, was dangerous. It inverted the moral order: the servant of God became the victim, and the so-called protector became the fool. The law was an act of damage control, an attempt to glue the story back together before it spread too far. If you listen closely, you can hear echoes of it today. One mistake at a public event, one video. One scandal, and suddenly new rules appear overnight. It is not about solving the problem. It is about proving that someone is still in charge. The same instinct that created medieval chivalry laws still runs through modern politics, sports, and corporate policies. The count probably did not care. He was rich, forgiven, and likely drinking again within the week. But history remembered his accident, not his victories. His broken lance turned into a rulebook. His hangover turned into legal history. And that is how one reckless knight, one unfortunate monk, and one very bad decision gave birth to the world's first recorded law against riding drunk. It was not written out of compassion. It was written out of fear: fear of laughter, fear of losing control, fear that one man's foolishness might make the whole system look human. It started in a bakery, not a battlefield. Somewhere in London. In the late 14th century, a baker decided to experiment. He shaped his dough into something new: a perfectly round loaf with a raised ring around the edge. It looked elegant, different, almost royal. People loved it. They called it the king's bread, half jokingly, admiring its crown-like shape. For a brief, innocent moment, it was just a clever design. But in medieval England, cleverness could be dangerous. One day, a royal official passed by the bakery, saw the loaf, and did not laugh. To him, it was not innovation, it was insult. The idea that a common tradesman had made something that resembled the crown itself felt like mockery. The baker was not just baking. He was, in the official's eyes, impersonating royalty. In a world built on strict hierarchy, even bread could cross a line. So the baker was dragged to court. His crime: showing disrespect to the crown through imitation. The charge sounds absurd now, but in the logic of medieval symbolism, it made perfect sense. Everything had layers of meaning, colors, shapes, gestures, even food. To mimic a royal symbol without permission was to borrow power that was not yours. The court made an example of him. He was fined heavily and, according to one account, forced to stand in the marketplace with the offending loaf tied around his neck, a public warning to anyone else who thought about baking too creatively. And to seal the humiliation, a new law was issued: no baker shall make or sell bread in any form resembling the crown, the cross, or any sacred emblem. From that moment, bread was no longer just food, it was politics. Bakers adjusted their designs carefully, flattening their loaves, shaping them plain and safe. The royal bread vanished from the streets, but the story spread faster than the smell of yeast. It became one more example of how the powerful could turn even the smallest act of creation into a question of loyalty. At first glance, it seems laughable: why would anyone care what shape a loaf of bread was? But in medieval Europe, symbols were everything. Power depended on appearance, and appearance depended on control. The monarchy needed to remind people that the crown was sacred, not a decoration to be copied. So even a baker's playful experiment became a threat. The deeper truth is that rulers feared ridicule more than rebellion. A war could be crushed. Laughter could not. Mockery eroded the illusion that authority was divine. If people could joke about the crown, maybe they would stop believing in it. The royal bread ban was an act of protection, not of the state, but of the myth that held the state together. And while the story might sound ridiculous now, it was not unique. Throughout Europe, similar decrees appeared: bans on using royal colors, limits on how tall one's hat could be, even restrictions on how much gold could decorate a belt. Ordinary people were reminded constantly that status was not just about money, it was about permission. What you wore, built, sang, or baked could all be seen as statements about your place in the order of things. The baker's punishment sent a message: creativity without deference was rebellion. It was safer to follow recipes than to invent. But this story also says something subtle about how fear works. The law was not written because bakers everywhere were sculpting crowns out of dough. It was written because one man's loaf embarrassed someone powerful enough to make it illegal. In that sense, the royal bread ban fits perfectly with all the strange laws of the era, each one born from one awkward, public moment that the authorities refused to laugh off. Even now, that logic survives. A politician makes a fool of himself on camera, and new media rules appear. A celebrity gets mocked online, and suddenly there is a debate about respect. Institutions hate being laughed at. They fear that laughter might reveal how fragile they really are. So maybe the baker was not just punished for the shape of his bread. Maybe he was punished for reminding people that kings and commoners both need the same dough. That power and poverty share the same ingredients. And in a world obsessed with hierarchy, that was the most dangerous recipe of all. He probably went back to his shop, baked something simpler, and tried to forget. But the law stayed. For centuries, bakers followed invisible rules written in fear, proof that sometimes the smallest loaf can leave the biggest mark on history. In 14th century Italy, inside a quiet Benedictine monastery, someone got bored. The monks' lives were ruled by rhythm, not of drums or dance, but of bells and prayers. Every hour had its chant, every chant had its tone, and every tone was the same. Holy, slow, and endlessly repeating. Then one evening, a young monk, no one remembers his name, decided that worship could use a melody. He slipped a few borrowed notes from a tavern song into a Gregorian hymn. It was harmless mischief, a moment of color in a gray day. But the other monks noticed. And they liked it. Soon, voices began to weave together. A harmony here, a playful rhythm there. Vespers turned into concerts. Some brothers even started adding instruments, a lute hidden behind a pillar, a small drum beneath a robe. What had started as devotion began to sound suspiciously joyful. At first, the abbot pretended not to hear. Maybe he even smiled once or twice. But as the music spread, it started to change the mood of the monastery. Evening prayers. Once solemn and heavy, now pulsed with warmth. Pilgrims began whispering that St. Cecilia herself had blessed the abbey. Visitors came not for silence, but for sound. And that was the problem. Monasteries were supposed to reflect obedience and order. Joy was fine, quiet joy, internal joy, but anything that drew attention to itself looked like pride. The abbot could not let it go on. One night, after catching two monks harmonizing near the cloister, he called a council. His speech was fiery. Music, he said, had become vanity. Rhythm was distraction. And if the devil cannot tempt a man's mind, he will tempt his melody. The next day, a new decree was carved into monastery rule. No singing or musical performance shall occur after the hour of sunset. It was the world's first known noise curfew law, written for monks. The abbey fell silent again officially. But silence rarely lasts when people have tasted freedom. Soon there were whispers behind the wine cellar, soft hums during work, and one brave soul who dared to whistle the forbidden tune during chores. He was sentenced to fasting, the medieval version of a timeout, but the tune lingered, spreading like smoke. Ironically, that silence law did the opposite of what the abbot intended. By trying to stop the music, he forced the monks to reinvent it. They began experimenting with layered voices, small variations, and overlapping tones that did not sound worldly but still kept the spirit alive. Without realizing it, those secret harmonies became the foundation of early polyphony, the first step toward Western choral music. Centuries later, church choirs across Europe would sing in styles born from that same rebellion, complex, layered, deeply human. All because a few monks got tired of monotony and slipped rhythm into prayer. When you think about it, the story says something larger than music. Every institution that worships order eventually meets someone who brings chaos, not out of hatred, but out of longing. The monks did not mean to break rules. They just wanted to feel closer to the divine in a way that sounded alive. But institutions do not handle alive well. They prefer obedient. And that is why laws like this appear, not because the act is wicked, but because it reminds those in charge how fragile control really is. There is something quietly beautiful about that, though. Even within stone walls, even under vows of silence, the human instinct to create keeps humming. No decree can erase it. So the next time you hear a choir or even someone singing softly when they should not, remember those monks who got punished for joy. They gave the world harmony by defying the idea that holiness must be quiet. Their story ends not with rebellion, but with transformation. The abbey's rule survived, but so did the music, disguised, reimagined, unstoppable. Because faith can silence a voice for a night, but not forever. Some laws are born from tragedy. Others, from sheer misunderstanding. This one came from both and maybe a touch of ego. In 15th century England, Lord Humphrey of Catterick was a man of wealth, horses, and pride. He had everything. Including a private carp pond he adored far too much. He called them noble fish, spoke to them as if they were his counsel, and fed them crumbs from his own table. So when his prized carps began swimming oddly one summer slow, crooked, and bumping into one another he saw only one possible explanation: the peasants had gotten them drunk. To be fair, the timing was suspicious. The village had just celebrated a festival with plenty of ale. And barrels were rolled everywhere. Rumor had it someone had poured leftover beer into the pond for good luck. Whether that happened or not, Lord Humphrey saw conspiracy. He summoned the village elders and demanded to know why his fish were under the influence. The peasants, terrified but honest, told him the truth: they were drunk, not the fish. The Lord did not buy it. He called an inquiry, as nobles love to do when they wanted paperwork to replace reason. Witnesses were questioned. The pond inspected, and even a local reeve poked the fish with a stick, solemnly reporting that they do appear lively beyond measure. That was all the evidence Humphrey needed. He declared the villagers guilty of willful inebriation of aquatic life. The sentence: a fine, the draining of the pond, and a written ordinance forbidding anyone from ever again intoxicating creatures of the Lord. Thus was born the law of drunken fish. It sounds absurd. But neighboring estates copied it almost immediately, not because they feared drunk carp, but because no one wanted to be the next landowner mocked by rumor. By week's end, the sobriety of fish was official policy across several shires. Of course, the fish had not been drunk at all. They would been overheated. The summer had boiled the pond, sapping its oxygen, and the poor creatures were sluggish, not spirited. But that did not matter. A noble's pride was worth more than biology. The paperwork was done, the law engraved, and the peasants paid their fine. And the irony. Months later, the pond was refilled, and the fish swam happily again. Lord Humphrey took it as proof that justice and his decree had restored divine order. If there is a lesson in that, it is this: when pride meets misunderstanding, law is the inevitable child. Medieval rulers could not admit ignorance. To say "I do not know why this happened" sounded too much like weakness. So they legislated explanations. Instead. It is easy to laugh, but the pattern survives. Modern committees still invent rules for things they do not understand. When something embarrassing happens, the instinct is not to ask why, but to outlaw it. No more of that, they declare, as if banning the symptom could erase the cause. The drunk fish ordinance remained on the books for decades, long after anyone remembered why it existed. Bureaucrats kept copying it forward, changing a few words each time. Somewhere, in some dusty archive, a record still likely reads, "Let no man pour ale, wine, or spirit into waters wherein swim the creatures of the Lord." It is both comedy and tragedy, a reminder that even in the most superstitious age, humans were not cruel for the sake of it. They were terrified of losing face. The peasants learned their lesson. The Lord kept his pride. And the fish, blissfully unaware of their legal fame, just kept swimming. A single hot day, a handful of overheated carp, and the fragile ego of one nobleman, that is all it took to make history. In 1324, in a small French town called Autun, faith was loud. Bells were everything. They marked births, deaths, weddings, storms, even gossip. To ring a church bell was to call heaven's attention. So when the townsfolk commissioned a new bronze bell for their cathedral, they wanted it grand. Heavy, polished, carved with angels and saints. A voice worthy of God. On the day of its first ringing, the entire town gathered. The priests blessed it. The mayor gave a speech about divine harmony. Children were told to remember this as the day the town spoke to heaven itself. And then, as if the heavens took that literally, a storm rolled in. Thunder cracked the sky. Lightning struck the tower directly. The bell's chain snapped. The beam gave way, and in a single horrifying clang, the massive bell broke free. It crashed through the wooden floors, splintered the stairs, and burst through the church doors. Then, as if alive, it rolled down the hill, crushing barrels, benches, and one poor merchant's fruit cart before finally coming to rest in the mud. No one died. But the shock was biblical. People swore the bell had moved with intention, that it was not just falling. It was fleeing. Some said they saw it roll in a perfect line, as if guided by an unseen will. Others whispered that it had grown tired of the mayor's taxes and sought better company. Whatever the truth, panic turned quickly into paperwork. The mayor called an emergency council. His opening line, recorded by one chronicler, was, "If even our bells abandon us, who will call God's mercy next Sunday?" The council agreed on the obvious culprit: negligence. Sure, but perhaps also the devil. After all, what else could make a holy object defy gravity and duty in the same day? So they wrote a law. From that moment forward, every bell in the town and later, in much of France, had to be chained or bound to its beam to prevent ungodly flight. The runaway bell law became the first official regulation of church hardware in Europe. Blacksmiths got busy forging iron clasps for bells that had hung freely for generations. Priests performed blessings over the metal, muttering prayers that sounded suspiciously like insurance contracts. For months, the sound of hammers echoed through the valleys, as if faith itself were being nailed into place. But the superstition stuck. For years afterward, people spoke of the possessed bell of Auden. Some said the lightning had awakened its spirit. Others believed the angel engraved on its side had tried to fly home. Travelers stopped to see the holy runaway, and the town quietly enjoyed the attention. Still, the law spread far beyond its borders. Other parishes, not wanting to be mocked or damned, passed similar decrees. Before long, France was full of chained bells so tightly secured, in some cathedrals, that they could barely ring. Villagers complained that their prayers sounded faint, and priests worried that God could not hear them. The irony was thick. In trying to keep heaven's voice safe, they would silence it. It is easy to see the absurdity now, but to them, it was order restored. The chain was not just for metal. It was for meaning. It said, "We are still in control. Even if lightning strikes, we have laws." And maybe that is why this story endures. It captures something timeless about the human need to legislate fear. When the world cracks open, when nature or chance embarrasses the powerful, we reach for rules, not reason. The runaway bell never rang again. It was too damaged, too heavy to repair. The town eventually cast a new one, smaller and simpler. It rang softly, as if afraid. But somewhere in that silence, you can still hear the echo of the law. It inspired proof that even metal could be guilty in the Middle Ages, and even chaos could be chained in the name of order. It happened somewhere in Burgundy. During a local dispute that had dragged on too long. A knight accused a village priest of withholding taxes. The priest accused the knight of stealing church land. Insults turned to threats, and threats, in that age, had only one ending: a duel. By law, clergy were not allowed to fight. But Father Antoine was not an ordinary priest. Before his calling, he had been a soldier in the Duke's army, tall, broad, and still carrying the kind of anger that does not wash off with holy water. When the knight challenged him, the priest accepted, saying, God made my arms strong before he made them merciful. The duel took place at dawn, on the edge of the monastery fields. Witnesses said the priest fought calmly, almost sadly. The knight came in swinging, arrogant and loud, but Antoine moved like a man who knew the weight of every blow. In minutes, the knight was on the ground, armor dented, sword snapped, blood on the grass. The priest stepped back, breathing hard, muttering something that might have been a prayer. The crowd did not cheer. They did not know what to do. A holy man had just defeated a noble, and that was terrifying. It was not supposed to happen. The church was meant to pray, the knights to fight. This moment blurred the lines, and medieval society hated blurred lines. Within days, word reached the bishop. He was horrified not by the violence, but by the implication. If a priest could win a duel, then maybe divine authority was not limited to prayer. Maybe power could come from faith and muscle. That idea was dangerous. The church's control depended on separation, spirit above sword, heaven above earth. So the bishop convened a council, and the council wrote a rule. No member of the clergy shall bear arms, nor engage in combat, under threat of excommunication. It became law across much of Europe, and it stuck. Monks could brew beer, collect taxes, even oversee executions, but they could never again lift a sword. The church turned that moment of embarrassment into doctrine, turning one rogue priest's victory into proof that such things must never happen again. But privately, many people admired Antoine. They whispered that he had defended justice when the knight abused his power. For peasants and commoners, he was a symbol, proof that holiness did not have to mean helplessness. For the church, he was a headache that needed erasing. The rule spread, and over time, it grew stricter. Even carrying a dagger could mean suspension. Priests who disobeyed had to perform long penances, barefoot pilgrimages, public confessions, weeks of silence. The image of the warrior priest vanished, replaced by the soft, obedient cleric we imagine now. And yet, in monasteries and borderlands, old habits lingered. There were priests who still trained in secret, calling it discipline of the body. There were even rumors of entire orders who fought quietly under other names, shepherds turned swordsmen when bandits threatened their flocks. History rarely records them, but they existed, in the shadows of faith. The irony of the clergy combat ban is that it was not about violence at all, it was about control. The church did not fear bloodshed. It feared unpredictability. A knight killing a priest was order. A priest beating a knight was chaos. And in that, you can see the medieval pattern again. Every strange law was a reaction to one uncomfortable truth. One pig, one goose, one drunk knight, one armed priest, each forced society to look in the mirror and say, that should not happen. Then they wrote a rule to make sure it would not. Father Antoine's duel faded from official records. But his story lingered in tavern talk and quiet prayers. Some said he repented, others that he vanished into exile. But his legend endured, the man of God who fought for what was right, and lost his place in heaven's bureaucracy for it. And maybe that is fitting. He did not break faith. He broke form. In a world obsessed with boundaries, he reminded everyone that sometimes the sacred and the human share the same hands. It started with a sound. A thin, rising whistle that cut through the quiet of a noblewoman's estate in Yorkshire, sometime in the early 1400s. Each night, just as the last candles were being snuffed out, someone whistled in the hills. It was not music, just a single, repeating note that floated through the dark like a warning. At first, people ignored it. Then the horses began panicking in their stables. Servants refused to go out after dusk. The noblewoman herself could not sleep. claiming the noise carried the breath of spirits. Finally, she summoned the town watch. Their search turned up nothing but a shepherd, half drunk, whistling to his dog while guarding sheep. He apologized, promised to stop, and for a while, peace returned. But gossip moves faster than reason. By winter, tales had spread of the whistler, a ghostly wanderer whose tune foretold death. Villagers claimed to hear it before livestock died or storms hit. Fear turned habit into omen. And because fear always needs a culprit, the noblewoman petitioned the local court for protection. The judge, rather than mock her, took it seriously. Respectable people did not imagine things that was for peasants. So the council met, debated, and drafted a decree. None shall whistle, pipe, or sound the lips after the ringing of the evening bell, under penalty of fine or imprisonment. And just like that, silence became sacred. At first, it was about superstition, a way to quiet nerves and regain control of the night. But soon, the law took on new uses. Night guards used it to arrest anyone wandering after dark. Tavern owners used it to close up early. Landlords used it to keep tenants from gathering outside. What began as an attempt to calm one anxious lady became a convenient tool for curfews and control. Over time, people forgot the origin. They just knew that whistling at night was bad luck, calling the devil, or inviting thieves. Parents warned children, do not whistle after sundown, or spirits will follow your sound home. By the 1500s, similar bands appeared across Europe from Prague to Florence, always dressed in moral language but rooted in fear of noise, mischief, and rebellion. Because sound carries freedom. It announces presence. And authority, in any age, prefers quiet. In cities, the night whistling law blurred with order codes. In villages, it blended with folklore. Sailors whispered that whistling angered the wind. Miners said it woke the dead. The rule became so ingrained that even long after the law vanished, the superstition stayed. In rural England, people still say never whistle after dark, unaware they are echoing a medieval curfew written for the convenience of one noblewoman and her frightened horses. It is strange how control hides itself in tradition. The law was not violent, yet it silenced a kind of joy. Shepherds stopped singing to their dogs. Drunkards stopped making up tunes on their way home. The nights grew quieter, heavier, as if the air itself had learned obedience. You can almost imagine that shepherd, sitting on his hill months later, staring down at the manor that started it all. Maybe he wanted to whistle again. Maybe he just breathed the melody instead, a small act of defiance swallowed by the dark. And that is the quiet irony of this story. It was not about sound at all. It was about control disguised as courtesy. The medieval world feared laughter, music, movement, anything spontaneous enough to remind people they were alive. So it outlawed sound after sunset and called it peace. But peace built on fear is just silence. And silence, enforced long enough, starts to echo. The story begins not in a castle or courtroom, but in a workshop in Prague during an early summer heatwave. The year was around 1471. And the city baked under a relentless sun. The river had dried to a sluggish brown line, and the air inside workshops was suffocating. Most craftsmen stripped down to survive the heat, shirts open, sleeves rolled, sweat turning sawdust to mud. But one carpenter, Jan Havel, took it further. Alone in his shop, trying to finish a commission for the royal household, he decided that clothes were unnecessary. He worked in nothing but his apron, humming to himself, skin glistening with sweat. To him, it was practical. To everyone else, it was a scandal waiting to happen. Fate, of course, delivered the audience. One morning, Queen Joanna passing through the street on her way to the chapel turned her head just as the wind caught the carpenter's door. There he was, hammer in hand, completely naked but for that small apron, frozen mid-swing like a statue of guilt. The queen gasped. Her attendants shrieked. The guards burst into laughter before remembering who was watching. By nightfall, the story had spread through the city like spilled wine. The naked carpenter of Prague became an instant legend. Street songs mocked the court, sermons thundered about lost morality, and merchants joked that their tools might start undressing next. The queen herself, humiliated and furious, demanded punishment not because she was offended by nudity, but because the gossip made her look foolish. So the city council met. They could not very well arrest a man for being hot. But they could make an example. Within days, they drafted a new decree. Let all who labor within public view be decently attired, lest indecency bring shame upon their craft. It was the first recorded workplace dress code in Europe. Jan Havel was fined and forced to stand outside his workshop fully clothed, holding a sign that read, "Modesty keeps order." The queen got her justice, the council got their moral victory, and the rest of Prague got a new rule, one born from heat, embarrassment, and a door that refused to stay shut. But the deeper story was not about one man's body. It was about image. The medieval world relied on appearances to define virtue. Clothing was not just fabric. It was morality made visible. To be naked was to remind people that beneath all the layers, noble or peasant, priest or queen, everyone was made of the same soft, fallible flesh. That reminder was intolerable. So modesty became regulation. Guilds adopted similar rules. Tailors codified standards of respectable attire. Even monks and scribes began writing about proper work garments as if sin could be measured by sleeve length. Over time, this became one of Europe's quietest but most enduring laws: dress equals discipline. The irony is that Jan's act was never rebellion. He was not trying to shock or challenge norms. He was just trying to breathe. His mistake was forgetting that in a society obsessed with control, even comfort can look like defiance. You can still see echoes of that today. Dress codes in offices, schools, and parliaments, all born from the same instinct, to hide the human body beneath symbols of restraint. The rule has simply changed costume. Jan's punishment faded into folklore. Painters even joked about him, sketching Saint Jan of the Apron, patron of heatstroke and humiliation. But behind the laughter lay a truth medieval life kept proving that most laws do not start with grand philosophy. They start with a moment that embarrassed the powerful. And so the naked carpenter's code joined the long list of rules written not for justice, but for dignity's sake, proof that sometimes, all it takes to change a city's morality is one man, one hammer, and one very inconvenient breeze. By the late 1400s, Europe was obsessed with order. But beneath the surface of laws and prayers, something else was spreading: superstition, wild and sticky as smoke. Strange reports began appearing in court records: a rooster that laid an egg, a pair of shoes that walked by themselves, a cow that wept at night. Every story seemed to demand explanation. And every explanation became a law. The rooster case was the first to draw attention. In Basel, Switzerland, a farmer's rooster supposedly laid an egg smooth, small, and pale. The townspeople panicked. Everyone knew rooster eggs were said to hatch basilisks, the mythical serpent whose gaze could kill. The authorities, not wanting to risk being the ones who ignored a demon, arrested the bird. It was tried in court, yes. Formally tried and found guilty of unnatural acts. The sentence: burned at the stake. A clerk recorded the trial in solemn Latin, as if it were a matter of state. Soon after, another case followed, this time in Burgundy, where a pair of boots was accused of witchcraft. Their owner claimed they walked on their own, which might have meant he simply kicked them in frustration, but the court took it seriously. The boots were seized, examined by priests, and found to be under the influence of malign enchantment. They, too, were burned. Then came the weeping cow. In a small village in Lorraine, a farmer reported that one of his cows had begun crying each night. Locals whispered that it mourned the souls of sinners. The priest, unnerved by the crowds gathering to witness it, declared the behavior unholy and ordered the cow exorcised. When the crying continued, likely a simple illness, the bishop intervened, issuing a new decree: no beast, object, or artifact shall be declared miraculous without clerical investigation and approval. That single rule became the backbone of dozens of later laws. What started as superstition became procedure. Every time something strange happened, an odd birth, a moving statue, milk that turned red, it was no longer enough to panic. It had to be reported, filed, examined, and judged. This was the birth of spiritual bureaucracy. And it shows how medieval people handled fear. They did not deny it. They domesticated it with paperwork. These decrees multiplied for two reasons. First, the Church wanted to maintain control over what counted as divine. The Reformation was still a whisper in the distance, and the Church could not risk ordinary people seeing miracles without permission. Second, rulers discovered that fear, once codified, was power. If people believed the state could command even demons and curses, their obedience deepened. The paradox was striking. The more laws they wrote to suppress superstition, the more they legitimized it. Every trial of a rooster or burning of a haunted shoe told the people that yes, evil was real and only authority could contain it. It is easy to mock now. But the psychology behind it has not changed. When people do not understand something, they reach for structure. We do not burn roosters anymore, but we still write laws against technologies we fear or trends we can't quite explain. Each one begins with a moment of panic, polished into policy. The superstition decrees show how fear evolves from whispers, to rituals, to statutes. Each new rule told a frightened world, we have got this under control. And maybe that is the strangest part, these laws were not written by madmen, but by anxious, rational people doing their best to make mystery manageable. By the time the Renaissance dawned, Europe was a continent of rules against the impossible. Miracles, curses, omens all required official paperwork. Priests had forms. Judges had procedures. And faith, once wild and full of wonder, was carefully filed away, stamped, and shelved under approved phenomena. The rooster was forgotten. The boots crumbled to ash. The cow eventually stopped crying. But the laws they inspired outlived them by centuries, proof that sometimes the surest way to keep superstition alive is to legislate against it. When you look back across these stories, pigs on trial, geese in armor, monks forbidden to sing, priests forbidden to fight, they seem like fragments of comedy. But together, they form something sharper, a portrait of a society terrified of embarrassment. The Middle Ages were full of faith and fear, but more than anything, they were full of people desperate to look like they were in control. Every absurd law came from a moment when that illusion cracked. A pig kills a child, and suddenly life feels random, so they invent a courtroom for animals. A goose ruins a joust. And nobility looks ridiculous, so they ban humor. A monk sings too joyfully, and holiness starts to sound human, so they silence music. None of these rules fixed the chaos they were reacting to. They just buried it under paperwork. The pattern is the same: one strange, embarrassing incident becomes a warning, a story retold until it hardens into statute. Fear of laughter becomes a fear of disorder. And fear of disorder becomes law. In the process, what begins as protection turns into theater. But that is how all authority survives. The language changes, but the reflex does not. A medieval council writes, "No goose shall be armored in jest." A modern board writes, "No employee shall post unapproved content online." Both are responses to the same thing, one unpredictable moment that made the powerful look human. It is tempting to read these medieval laws as superstition or ignorance. But they were, in their way, logical. The world was dangerous, disease constant, justice fragile. If the universe felt random, then every rule was a small spell against chaos. Laws were not just legal, they were rituals, meant to reassure everyone that someone, somewhere, still knew what was going on. And yet, beneath all that fear, there is something oddly tender. These people were not fools. They were trying to live with uncertainty. To give meaning to accidents, to make the world behave. Their mistake was not that they believed in nonsense. It was that they mistook control for comfort. That is why these stories still resonate. We still invent rules for what unsettles us, just with different costumes. A child gets hurt in a playground, and instead of accepting that accidents happen, we outlaw the equipment. A viral mishap sparks outrage. And instead of laughing it off, we draft a policy. We keep building cages for the things we can't explain, calling them guidelines, codes, or best practices. The Middle Ages only look strange until you notice how familiar they are. Every absurd decree, from the drunk fish to the runaway bell, was an attempt to keep the universe tidy. And though centuries have passed, we still do the same thing. We legislate against discomfort, decorate it with reason, and pretend it will hold. In the end, that is what these medieval laws teach most clearly: not how ignorant people once were, but how human they still are in us. We have traded cathedrals for offices, sermons for statements, but the impulse is unchanged. When the world refuses to make sense, we do not face it. We draft another rule. And maybe that is the real relic of the Middle Ages. Not the castles or the relics or the stained glass, but the quiet belief that if we just write enough laws, we can stop chaos from rolling down the hill like a runaway bell. So when you step back from all of it, the pigs, the priests, the geese, the carp, the monks, you start to see the strange beauty of their logic. Every ridiculous law was a love letter to control, a way of saying, we refuse to let the world stay wild. They were not monsters or fools. They were people living with fear, shame, and wonder, building cages out of paper and prayer. And maybe that is what makes the Middle Ages so haunting. Their absurdity feels ancient, but the reflex feels close. We still write rules to tame things that scare or embarrass us. We still try to legislate meaning when the world makes none. The difference is only the costume. So the next time you hear about some oddly specific regulation, something that sounds too stupid to be real, remember. It probably began the same way these did, with one absurd afternoon and one very serious face trying to fix it forever. Thanks for listening, and for wandering back through the dusty corners of history with me tonight. I will see you in the next story, where the laws might make a little more sense, but the people behind them never will.